Hospitals are battlefields where the invisible often walk among the arrogant. When a crowded emergency room repeatedly mocked a quiet, limping janitor, no one expected the chaos that followed. A bleeding, thrashing Green Beret was wheeled in, and the entire room froze when the soldier locked eyes with the mop pusher and roared, "Commander!" The emergency room at St. Jude's Medical Center in downtown Chicago was a meat grinder on a Friday night. To triage nurse Sarah Jenkins, it was a familiar symphony of chaos, the shrieking wail of ambulance sirens, the sterile smell of iodine and bleach masking the coppery scent of blood, and the relentless panicked hum of human suffering. Sarah had been a nurse for 12 years. She knew how to compartmentalize the trauma, how to look a grieving mother in the eye with steady composure, and how to anticipate a doctor's order before it was even spoken. But what Sarah couldn't compartmentalize was the casual cruelty of her own colleagues. Her eyes drifted across the waiting area to Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was the night shift janitor, a man who seemed to exist entirely in the periphery of the hospital's high-stakes drama. He was in his late 50s, his hair a shock of wiry steel gray, his shoulders slightly stooped under the oversized faded gray overalls he always wore. He walked with a pronounced rhythmic limp, a stiff dragging of his right leg that echoed softly against the linoleum floors. No one knew much about Arthur, and more importantly, no one cared to ask. To the brilliant high-strung medical staff of St. Jude's, Arthur was little more than a piece of mobile furniture. He was the man who made the blood and vomit disappear so they could move on to the next patient. "Watch your feet, mop jockey!" A sharp voice barked across the hallway. Sarah winced. It was Dr. Richard Collins. Collins was the ER's top attending physician, a brilliant trauma surgeon with a god complex that took up half the room. He was tall, impeccably groomed, even at 2 a.m., and notoriously impatient. Arthur had been quietly mopping up a spilled tray of saline and coffee near Trauma Bay 1. He immediately stopped pulling his mop bucket back against the wall to let Dr. Collins and his entourage of medical residents pass. "I swear," Dr. Collins sneered to a nervous first-year resident, loud enough for half the floor to hear, "The man moves like a broken turtle. You'd think with the union wages we pay, they could hire someone who doesn't need a medical intervention just to push a sponge. Try not to slip on his mediocrity, people." A few of the residents offered weak, sycophantic chuckles. Sarah felt a hot flare of anger in her chest. She slammed her clipboard onto the triage desk, ready to snap at Collins, but a subtle movement caught her eye. Arthur hadn't flinched. He didn't look down in shame, nor did he glare in anger. He simply stood at parade rest, his calloused hands resting lightly on the wooden handle of his mop. His expression was completely unreadable, his pale blue eyes focused on a point far beyond Dr. Collins's head. There was a strange, terrifying stillness to the old janitor. Once the arrogant doctor had swept past Arthur, silently resumed his work, Sarah grabbed a fresh cup of coffee from the break room and walked over to him. "Arthur," she said softly, offering the steaming styrofoam cup. "Don't listen to him. Collins is a miserable bastard to everyone. You do a great job." Arthur paused, taking the cup with a slight nod. His hands were heavily scarred, Sarah noticed not for the first time. Thick white lines crisscrossed his knuckles, and a deep, jagged burn scar disappeared up the sleeve of his uniform. "Thank you, Nurse Jenkins," Arthur replied. His voice was like gravel scraping against oak, deep, quiet, and rough. "It doesn't bother me. A man's character is revealed not by how he treats his superiors, but by how he treats those he deems beneath him." Sarah smiled gently. Still, you shouldn't have to take it. I've taken worse from better men, Arthur said, a fleeting ghost of a smile, touching his lips before vanishing. He took a sip of the coffee, gave her a respectful nod, and went back to his bucket. Sarah walked back to her desk, her mind lingering on Arthur. There was an unspoken weight to him. The way he folded his cleaning rags into perfect uniform squares. The way his eyes constantly scanned the room, noting the exits, the blind spots, the shifting moods of the patients. He didn't move like a broken old man. He moved like a predator forced into an uncomfortably small cage, pacing carefully to avoid breaking the glass. But there was no time to dwell on the mysteries of the janitorial staff. The red emergency phone on the triage desk lit up with a harsh, glaring flash. Sarah snatched the receiver. St. Jude's ER Jenkins. "Sarah, we're coming in hot." The panicked voice of Thomas Reed, a veteran paramedic, crackled through the line. 3 minutes out, we have a John Doe, mid-30s, victim of an armed robbery at a convenience store. He intervened. Multiple stab wounds to the torso, possible punctured lung, and a gunshot wound to the right thigh. Vitals are crashing, but what, Tom? Sarah pressed her pen, flying across the intake form. But the guy is a tank. He's bleeding out, but he's fighting us. We had to use heavy sedatives just to get him on the stretcher, and they're barely touching him. Have security waiting. Understood. Trauma Bay 1 is prepped, Sarah said, slamming the phone down. She hit the PA button. Level 1 Trauma Bay 1. Dr. Collins ETA 2 minutes. Security to the ambulance bay. The quiet hum of the ER instantly shattered, replaced by the synchronized adrenaline-fueled sprint of nurses and doctors preparing for war. The double doors of the ambulance bay exploded open. Paramedic Thomas Reed and his partner were practically sprinting, shoving a blood-slicked gurney into the harsh fluorescent light of the ER. "Make way coming through!" Tom roared over the din. Sarah ran alongside the gurney as they rushed toward Trauma Bay 1. She took one look at the patient and gasped. The man on the stretcher was massive, easily 6'3", with thick, heavily corded muscles, slick with sweat and blood. His clothes had been cut away, revealing a torso covered in old, faded combat scars and 3 new jagged knife wounds pouring dark, arterial blood. But what was truly terrifying was that the man was conscious. His eyes were blown wide, feral, and unseeing. He wasn't in Chicago anymore. He was somewhere far away, lost in a nightmare of cordite and sand. Despite the catastrophic blood loss, he was thrashing violently against the heavy leather restraints the paramedics had strapped across his chest and legs. "He woke up halfway here," Tom shouted over the patient's guttural roars. "Sedatives did absolutely nothing. He snapped the left arm restraint like it was a shoelace." Dr. Collins was waiting in the trauma bay, flanked by 3 nurses and 2 burly hospital security guards. "Get him on the table. On my count 1, 2, 3, move." They hoisted the massive man onto the trauma table. The second his back hit the cold steel, the patient let out a deafening roar and violently threw his right arm out, catching one of the security guards in the chest and sending the 200-pound man crashing into a cart of surgical instruments. "Hold him down." Dr. Collins screamed, his polished composure entirely gone. "I need an airway. I need 2 large-bore IVs, stat. Push another 10 milligrams of haloperidol." "Doctor, his blood pressure is tanking 70/40, Sarah yelled, struggling to pin down the man's left arm so another nurse could find a vein. It was like trying to hold down a thrashing alligator. The man's muscles were locked in rigid, panicked defiance. "Get off me!" the patient screamed. It wasn't the cry of a civilian in pain. It was the commanding, furious bark of a soldier under fire. "Ambush, get down. They're in the wire." "He's having a PTSD flashback," Sarah realized aloud, her heart pounding. She noticed a heavy set of dog tags tangled in the blood on his chest. She squinted, catching the name stamped into the metal. Miller David, Master Sergeant, U.S. Army. "He's a Green Beret," Sarah yelled to Collins. "Master Sergeant, we need to calm him down. He thinks he's captured." "I don't care if he's Captain America," Collins shrieked, backing away, as Miller's thrashing legs snapped another leather strap. "He's bleeding out from the femoral artery. If we don't clamp it, he's dead in 3 minutes. Security, get in here and put your weight on him." 2 more security guards rushed into the small room, but Miller was a force of pure adrenaline-fueled instinct. Even dying, his body remembered the brutal close-quarters combat training of special forces. He twisted his hips, throwing 2 guards off balance, and ripped his left arm entirely free from Sarah's grip. Blood sprayed across the white sterile drapes as the makeshift tourniquet on his thigh slipped. The monitors above the bed began to scream, a high-pitched, terrifying warning. "Beep, beep, beep, beep." "He's going into hypovolemic shock," a resident yelled. Dr. Collins froze. The brilliant surgeon, faced with a violent, chaotic variable he couldn't control, simply froze. We can't operate. It's not safe. Back away. Let him tire out." "He doesn't have time to tire out. He'll die," Sarah screamed at the doctor, horrified. Outside the glass doors of Trauma Bay, when the rest of the ER had ground to a halt, patients and staff alike watched the horrific scene unfolding, and then the glass doors slid open. Arthur Pendleton walked into the room. He didn't have his mop. He moved past the cowering residents, his limp suddenly seeming less like a disability and more like a deliberate, measured stride. "Hey, what the hell are you doing in here?" Dr. Collins snapped, finding his voice only to yell at the janitor. "Get out security! Remove this idiot!" Arthur ignored him entirely. He didn't even look at the doctor. His pale blue eyes were locked dead onto the thrashing, bleeding face of Master Sergeant David Miller. Arthur stepped right into the danger zone, right next to the bed where the giant soldier was throwing wild, devastating punches into the air. "Arthur, please!" Sarah cried out, terrified. The old man was about to be killed by a stray blow. Arthur reached out. His scarred, calloused hand clamped down on Miller's left wrist. It wasn't a gentle, nurse-like touch, nor was it the panicked grip of the security guards. It was a vice-like, unyielding grip of pure authority. Miller froze. The soldier's wild, feral eyes snapped toward the old man in the gray overalls. For a second, the heavy breathing of the bleeding man and the shrieking of the heart monitor were the only sounds in the room. Arthur leaned down, his face inches from the soldier's. His voice, usually a quiet rasp, suddenly boomed through the trauma bay with a terrifying, ironclad command that rattled the medical tools on their trays. "Master Sergeant Miller!" Arthur roared, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed in the fires of hell. "Stand down, soldier. You are secure. You are in friendly territory. That is a direct order. Do you copy?" The silence in the room became absolute. The security guard stopped pulling. Dr. Collins stood with his mouth agape. Sarah stared, the hairs on her arms standing straight up. Miller's chest heaved. The wild terror in his eyes slowly, agonizingly dissolved. He stared into the scarred face of the old janitor. Miller's pupils, blown wide with panic, suddenly focused. He looked at Arthur's eyes, then down at the jagged burn scar on the old man's wrist, and then back up to his face. Tears mixed with blood and sweat spilled over the edges of the Green Beret's eyes. His rigid muscles instantly went slack, melting into the trauma bed. With his remaining strength, the dying giant of a man raised his trembling, blood-soaked right hand, bringing his fingers to his forehead in a weak but perfect military salute. "Copy that," Miller choked out, his voice cracking with awe and relief. "Commander." Arthur returned the salute with sharp, snapping precision, standing taller than anyone in the room had ever seen him. "Rest now, Sergeant," Arthur said softly. "I've got the watch." Miller's eyes fluttered shut, his body completely relaxing. Arthur didn't move his eyes from the soldier. He simply reached over, grabbed Dr. Collins by the collar of his expensive scrubs, and shoved the stunned surgeon toward the bleeding thigh. "Clamp the artery, doctor," the janitor ordered, his voice cold as ice. "Now." Dr. Richard Collins had never been shoved a day in his professional life, let alone by a member of the custodial staff. For a fraction of a second, indignation flared in his chest, but it was immediately extinguished by the absolute freezing authority radiating from the old man in the gray overalls. Arthur's eyes did not leave the doctor. They were flat hard and expectant. Swallowing his pride, Dr. Collins turned back to the trauma table. The panic that had paralyzed him evaporated, replaced by the mechanical life-saving muscle memory of a trauma surgeon. "Clamp," Collins barked, extending his hand. Sarah slapped the stainless steel instrument into his palm. Collins dove into the bloody chasm of Miller's thigh, his fingers deftly navigating the torn tissue until he found the severed femoral artery. With a sharp click, the clamp locked into place. The dark pulsing geyser of blood instantly ceased. Artery secured, Collins breathed, his forehead shining with sweat. "Let's get those fluids wide open. Push 2 units of O- stat. We need to stabilize his pressure before we move him to the OR to repair the lung and the leg." The trauma bay transformed from a chaotic brawl back into a synchronized medical machine. As the nurses and residents swarmed the bed, securing lines and preparing the massive soldier for transport, Sarah glanced over her shoulder. Arthur had stepped back into the periphery. The imposing iron-spined commander, who had just dominated a room full of panicked professionals, was gone. In his place was the stooped, quiet man with the pronounced limp. He slowly walked over to the sink in the corner, turned on the tap, and began washing the blood off his scarred hands with cheap pink antibacterial soap. He dried his hands on a paper towel, picked up his yellow mop bucket, and quietly pushed it out of the sliding glass doors, disappearing down the brightly lit corridor. 3 hours later, the ER had settled into a dull, manageable hum. Master Sergeant David Miller had survived the surgery and was resting in the intensive care unit on the 4th floor. Sarah found Arthur in the deserted hospital cafeteria. He was sitting alone at a small laminate table in the corner, staring down at a lukewarm cup of black coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows across his deeply lined face. She walked over and gently sat across from him. "He made it," Sarah said softly. "The bullet missed the bone but tore the artery. The knife wounds missed his heart by an inch. But he's going to live because of you." Arthur didn't look up. He just nodded slowly. "Sergeant Miller is a tough kid, always was." "You know him?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with quiet astonishment. Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee. I knew him when he was a 19-year-old private with too much courage and not enough sense. He was assigned to my unit. Arthur, Sarah said, leaning forward. Who are you? Truly. The old man finally looked up, his pale blue eyes carrying a weight that Sarah could barely comprehend. My name is Arthur Hayes, he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. 30 years ago, I was commissioned as an officer in the United States Army. I spent 25 of those years in the Special Forces. I retired as a colonel. Sarah sat back stunned. A retired Special Forces colonel, pushing a mop, cleaning up vomit and spilled saline while arrogant doctors berated him. But why are you here? She asked, gesturing to his gray janitorial uniform. With your rank, your experience, you could be consulting, teaching, running a company. Why are you working the night shift as a janitor? Arthur looked down at his hands, tracing the thick white burn scar that ran up his wrist. When you spend your entire life making decisions that determine whether young men live or die, Arthur said quietly, you eventually reach a point where your soul cannot bear the weight of another casualty. I spent a quarter of a century commanding men in the darkest, most violent corners of this earth. I ordered good men into the fire. Some of them came back. Many of them did not. He paused, the silence stretching between them. When I was medically discharged after my last deployment, the silence of civilian life was deafening. The corporate world, the consulting gigs, it all felt hollow. I realized I didn't want to carry the burden of consequence anymore. I just wanted to serve. Quietly, I wanted a job where the biggest crisis of my night was a clogged drain or a spilled cup of coffee. I wanted to clean up messes that could actually be washed away. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at this incredible man hiding his brilliance and trauma behind a yellow mop bucket, seeking penance and peace in the most humble way imaginable. Before she could speak, the cafeteria door swung open. Dr. Richard Collins walked in. He looked exhausted, the arrogant sneer wiped completely from his face. He spotted them in the corner and hesitated before walking over. Collins stood awkwardly by the table. He didn't look at Sarah. His eyes were fixed entirely on Arthur. The surgery was a success, Collins said, his voice unusually subdued. He's awake. He's asking for you. Arthur stood up slowly, the familiar limp returning to his gait. He didn't say a word to the surgeon. He just walked past him, heading toward the elevators. Sarah immediately stood up and followed with Collins, trailing silently behind them. When they reached the ICU, Miller was lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to an array of monitors and IV drips. He looked pale and exhausted, but the feral panic was completely gone from his eyes. When Arthur walked into the room, Miller attempted to sit up, wincing in pain. Easy, son, Arthur said, gently stepping to the bedside and pressing a hand to the soldier's uninjured shoulder. You've sprung enough leaks for one night, Colonel Hayes. Miller breathed a weak smile breaking across his face. I thought I was hallucinating. What are you doing here, sir? Just holding down the fort, Sergeant, Arthur replied. Dr. Collins, standing near the doorway, frowned. Wait, Colonel, he called you commander in the ER. Miller turned his head to look at the doctor. The soldier's eyes hardened. You don't know who this man is, do you? Miller asked, his voice weak, but laced with incredulity. None of you do. Collins shook his head slowly. That man, Miller said, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur, is a legend in the regiment. 7 years ago in the Korangal Valley, our platoon was ambushed by a force 5 times our size. We were pinned down in a rocky ravine. No air support, running out of ammo. We were going to die there. Sarah and Collins listened in stunned silence. Arthur kept his eyes fixed on the floor. The colonel here was leading the extraction team. Miller continued, his voice thick with emotion. When the choppers couldn't land because of heavy RPG fire, he didn't turn back. He and his team moved in on foot. They fought through 2 miles of vertical terrain. When they reached us, we were completely overrun. Miller paused, coughing weakly. Sarah stepped forward to adjust his oxygen, but he waved her off. A grenade landed right in the middle of my squad. Miller said, tears welling in his eyes. Colonel Hayes dove on it. It was a dud, thank God, but in the ensuing firefight, a burning Humvee collapsed onto his leg and arm. Miller pointed to Arthur's dragging right leg and the heavy burn scar on his wrist. He was pinned burning alive, but he kept firing his sidearm, covering us while we dragged the wounded to the extraction zone. He refused to be medevaced until every single one of his men was on a bird. Miller looked back up at Arthur, his voice dropping to a whisper. He gave up his career, his body to save 22 kids he barely knew. He is the greatest commander I have ever served under. The room fell deadly silent. The rhythmic beep-beep of the heart monitor was the only sound. Sarah looked at Dr. Collins. The brilliant, arrogant trauma surgeon was staring at Arthur, his face completely drained of color. The realization of how he had treated this man, how he had mocked him, belittled him, and called him a broken turtle, crashed over him like a physical blow. Collins stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. Arthur, Colonel Hayes, The words choked in his throat. The man who always had a sharp retort, a cutting insult, or a brilliant diagnosis was utterly speechless. I am so deeply sorry. Arthur turned to look at the doctor. There was no anger in the old man's eyes, no vindication, just a profound, quiet understanding. You are an exceptional surgeon, Dr. Collins, Arthur said evenly. You save lives, but you must remember that the hospital does not function solely on your brilliance. It functions because the nurses prep the rooms. It functions because the paramedics keep them breathing in the ambulance. And it functions because men like me make sure the floor is clean enough for you to work your miracles without slipping. Arthur stepped closer to the doctor. Titles and degrees do not make a man superior, Arthur said, his voice firm. They simply give him a different set of tools to serve others. Never mistake your role for your worth, and never assume that the quiet man in the corner hasn't walked through fires you couldn't possibly imagine. Collins swallowed hard tears, pricking the corners of his eyes. He slowly nodded. Yes, sir. I understand. Arthur turned back to Miller, offering a gentle smile. Get some rest, David. You've fought enough battles for one lifetime. You too, Commander, Miller whispered. Arthur walked out of the ICU, his limp echoing softly in the quiet hallway. Sarah watched him go, a profound sense of awe washing over her. From that night forward, the dynamic of the St. Jude's ER completely shifted. Dr. Collins never raised his voice at the staff again. He treated the nurses, the technicians, and the security guards with a quiet, respectful dignity. And every night when Arthur Pendleton arrived for his shift, donning his faded gray overalls and picking up his yellow mop bucket, the doctors and nurses would step aside to let him pass. They didn't mock him. They didn't ignore him. They looked at the quiet man with the dragging leg, and they saw exactly what he was: a silent guardian, a hero in hiding, holding the watch so the rest of them could save the world. True leadership isn't found in a title, and heroism rarely wears a flashy uniform. Arthur's story reminds us that the quietest people often carry the heaviest burdens and the most profound wisdom. We must treat everyone with dignity, from the brilliant surgeon to the humble janitor, because you never know the fires someone has walked through to get to where they are today. If this story inspired you, please hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories.